Hello and welcome back to another episode of Thoughts Per Episode Classic Doctor Who Edition. Today we will be talking about the serial The Space Museum. Just in case it's been a few decades since you last watched this, I'll give you a quick recap. The TARDIS has a little bit of a malfunction and the crew land out of time. They are able to visit the Space Museum without being seen by any of the guards, and they find an exhibit which is just the four of them in, I guess, stasis. They surmise that at some point they get captured and put on display as a living exhibit, and that is their ultimate fate, which needs to be avoided. As we progress through the story, we learn that this is a planet called Zeros, and it has a civilization of Zerons who were invaded by a race called the Moroks. The Moroks are the keeper of the museum, and they hold it as a kind of living tribute to all of their victories in battle. And the Zerons have to lead... Well, Vicky inspires them to lead a revolution against the Moroks to overthrow them. And eventually, that is what ends up changing the future. I found this episode very interesting because bar that one two-parter, which didn't really make much sense, actually I'll go look up the name of it. The Edge of Destruction, I have a video on that if you want to go back and watch that. It's earlier in this playlist. Besides maybe that episode, this show hasn't actually tackled the idea of traveling through time besides it just being a vehicle. So it's interesting that they decided to actually write an episode or a serial which does tackle, like, oh, what happens if the TARDIS malfunctions and they see their own future and have to try and avoid it. Having to try and avoid a bad future is a thing which props up a few times later on in Doctor Who, and it's not always so easily avoidable as prompting a revolution, but for the sake of this story, I think that did make sense. The idea that... Actually, no, it doesn't make sense at all. No, think about it. If the four of them get captured, that means that they were there no matter what, right? The four of them get captured because the four of them arrived and were seen and captured. So Vicky's intervention in spurring a revolution isn't necessarily something that wouldn't have happened anyway if they had been captured and put on display. I just realised this episode doesn't actually make sense. But I shouldn't expect it to, because there are a couple of things which are a little bit goofy. We'll get to them as I go through my notes. Overall, though, what did I think? I thought, it was a pretty decent four-parter. It didn't overstay its welcome. I did kind of watch it in two parts. I watched the first two parts, almost a week ago at this point, and the other two parts just now. It is a nice shining moment for Vicky, because it's Vicky's subplot which ends up saving the TARDIS crew. I'm getting a little bit tired of the archetypal narrative of, we land here and there's these two factions which oppose each other, and one of them is the oppressor and one of them is the underdog, and then someone in the TARDIS crew inspires the underdog to overthrow the oppressors and then saves the day. We've done that story a few times now, but I guess this is the 60s. But, we literally just did that in the previous serial in the Web Planet. Come on. Okay, so at the very beginning of the episode, when time goes wibbly, and there's a weird moment when the TARDIS crew kind of fade out, and then they wake up all in different clothing. And, Ian is rightly quite flummoxed by this. Barbara and Vicky are quite surprised by this. The Doctor doesn't really care. He is uncharacteristically incurious about this, and it led me to wonder whether he had some kind of knowledge that the others did not, regarding the sequence of events, but no, that did not turn out to be the case. I loved the introduction of, us learning about time being wibbly. I'm going to keep calling it wibbly, don't mind me, with the smashed glass of water then unsmashing itself. Very cool. Now, I liked when they finally got to the Space Museum and they found a Dalek from Skaro, and, the Doctor's being cheeky and he climbs in and he kind of we don't see him climb in, but we see him poke his head out, and I think that's a pretty famous moment, because when you search for Doctor Who, or I guess at least classic Doctor Who, or the first Doctor or whatever in GIFs, usually that's one of the things that comes up. I did the Leonardo DiCaprio pointing meme. It's like, I've seen that before! Just a side note, but the idea that the Moroks have a, Dalek casing in their museum suggests that they have actually defeated the Daleks in combat, which of course doesn't mean much for this show from 1965 where the Daleks have shown up a couple times, but from where I'm sat in 2023, where the Daleks are this major threat who are pretty much impossible to defeat, that's pretty surprising that the Morlocks were able to do that. I like that Vicky recognizes the Dalek from the history books as well, because obviously she comes from the future compared to Barbara and Ian, and she will know the Dalek invasion of Earth as fairly ancient Earth history at that point. Something I wrote down is that the Doctor being a museum exhibit reminds me of The Last Dodo. Now, if you don't know what The Last Dodo is, it's a wonderful bit of extended universe fiction. It's a novel of the 10th Doctor and Martha, and I haven't read it in a long time, but the idea is that there is this giant planet-sized museum, and when, I don't know how spoilery this is for the book, I don't think it's that spoilery, but when the Doctor is recognised as a Time Lord, he may or may not be in danger of becoming an exhibition himself. It's a really good book. I really want to get around to reading more Doctor Who novels. I should really continue that. I liked when the Doctor said, "I think you're all going to be delighted. I'm going to come up with the answer." He's such a little cheeky gremlin boy, I love him. At one point in the second episode, Ian finds a real gun and just starts playing with it. That's cool, man. Good job. Way to go. You have fun with that. Make sure you don't shoot your friends accidentally, huh? There's also a moment when Ian tries to bite a cardigan apart, or I guess Barbara's cardigan apart. I no longer remember the reason why I watched this episode a week ago, and all I wrote down was that he's being very goofy in this episode. Now, these Morlocks have some interesting technology, because in episode 2 they use some mind-reading technology to figure out where the Doctor's companions are, and then in episode 3 or 4 Vicky has to hotwire a lie detecting lock machine so that they can access the armory, and she does do that pretty capably, but the idea is that the machine asks you questions which you have to get right, and it's a lie detector, and it can tell if you're lying, so you have to be telling the truth about the questions that you need to get right, which is an interesting concept that I have not really seen done before, surprisingly. As a little bit of sci-fi technology, that's pretty cool. But yeah, as I mentioned, Vicky pretty much surpasses it with ease. Barbara gets locked inside a cupboard for a while, which is unfortunate for her. There's a statue inside that cupboard, because remember, this is a museum, except it's just a man in a costume, and he accidentally moves at one point. That was unnerving. Blink isn't supposed to happen for a few more decades. Oh my god, headcanon time? Was that a weeping angel? Was there a weeping angel in that cupboard with Barbara, and they just so happened to, No, never mind. One of the Zerons, one of the natives, offers to go find Barbara, and these two have the dumbest cliffhanger I have seen in the show up until this point. It's not technically a cliffhanger. The actual cliffhanger of the episode was something different, but their subplot cliffhanger, if you know what I mean. As they're escaping in episode 3, one of the Morlocks, the head Morlock in charge, whose name I didn't write down, says, "Well, we know that they're in the Space Museum. Let's flood the Space Museum with paralyzing gas." And so Barbara and this Zeron have to contend with paralyzing gas, and they do not make it. They fall over, unconscious, ready to be locked up and kidnapped. And the next time we see them, in the next episode, Barbara wakes up and shakes the other guy awake, and there is still gas, and they just get up and carry on. Because that's how gas works, I guess. It was just a complete non-issue. They just slept it off, I guess, while the gas was still in the air. Honestly, I feel like I must have missed something there. It can't be that dumb, right? It is the second non-issue. No, actually, it's the first. It's the first of 2 non-issues in this story, however, because at one point, while Vicky, when Barbara meets up with Vicky, Barbara's Zeron friend and Vicky's Zeron friend, they're all talking together, and then some Morlocks show up and kill the Zerons brutally in front of them by shooting them, and they fall over, apparently dead, except not, because at the end of the episode they get up and they're fine. They're just fine. It's fine, they just got shot and they're fine. Don't worry about it. They didn't even do anything important afterwards. Maybe that was just a writer's note in the editing room, like, Do they have to stay dead? That's a bit morbid, isn't it? I like how the Doctor mentions that he gets rheumatism when he gets cold, because at this point, I'm jumping ahead a bit, Ian has now, he picks up a gun and he holds a Morlock at gunpoint and forces him to go and save the Doctor. And I'll talk about that in a second, but yeah, he's like, oh, I get rheumatism when I get cold. Just a reminder of what a crotchety old man. No, that's mean. Just a reminder that while the Doctor is brilliant and intelligent, he is also, in this point in his first life's incarnation, an old man. But yeah, it's weird to imagine a modern Doctor Who story where a companion holds someone at gunpoint and forces them to save the Doctor's life. I guess it could happen. I feel like it has more serious connotations these days, I don't know. But yeah, Ian is very much an action hero in this serial. The Doctor mentions that he was conscious the entire time that he was in stasis, which brings up a horrible realization, not in the show, but to me, that if they did get captured and put on display, they would just be conscious the entire time, just losing their minds in boredom. That is actually potentially a fate worse than death. Like, when they saw themselves on display in the first episode, I thought they were overreacting a bit, but the more I think about it, the more fucked up that is. Anyway, Vicky's revolution shows up, saves them in the nick of time, future averted, the day is saved, and the Doctor says that the reason that they were having trouble was because something tripped in the TARDIS. There was some sci-fi babble in there, but of course I didn't absorb that. You're not supposed to absorb that. You're just supposed to smile and nod and accept it. But interestingly, the example he gave was, like when you turn on a light switch at home, and sometimes it takes a couple of seconds for the light to turn on, because something has gone in the thing, and it takes a second for it to click, right? And Barbara's like, yeah, I think everyone's had that. That happens all the time. That is not a thing that happens these days. At least not to me. I've never had that. I get a feeling that might be one of those things that, as I mention it, people who were around back then might now stop and think and go, oh yeah, that did used to happen a lot. That hasn't happened in years. Obviously it's not a major thing. Obviously it's not important. It's just a cute little reminder that this show was made in another time. And the tiny little infinitesimal things that make up the fabric of our everyday life change minutely over years, to the point where we just don't notice when things change anymore. When certain problems go away, when certain other problems arrive, they're not like, a big enough deal to be a problem in the fact of like realizing that it's changed. I'm willing to bet it's one of those. Either that, or I've just been very lucky for my electrics, but I feel like it's probably just we've changed the way we do our light bulbs these days and our electrics. Now, at the very end of this episode, there was a tie-in to the next episode, and I didn't realise we were getting another Dalek serial so soon. It turns out the Daleks were watching the TARDIS crew that entire time and now refer to them as their greatest enemies. The Daleks are now in possession of a time machine of their own, and that's obviously going to lead into the Executioners, which I will see you back here next week, or hopefully next week, to talk about. I mean, it is a 6-parter, maybe a couple of weeks. I believe that might be Ian and Barbara's final serial as well, which will be sad. I don't want them to go. I mean, Ian I could take or leave. He's fine. He's a product of his time. But Barbara, I'm going to miss Barbara so much. I'd say it's going to be hard to imagine the show without them, but I was literally brought up on the show without them, but you know what I mean. Before I leave, I do just want to stop and wonder, like, the first 2 times we've seen these Daleks, the first one we blew up their base on Skaro and apparently finished them all off for good, right? And secondly, the second time, that was a Dalek invasion of Earth. That was a period of history. And that was, the Daleks weren't soundly defeated at the time, but, the revolution was underway, right? That was what Susan stayed to help with. So I'm curious, is it going to be addressed where these Daleks come from? Or is it just going to be like, it doesn't matter. It's Daleks. Who cares? Kid show. Smile. Daleks. More Daleks. I'm betting on option 2 because Doctor Who continuity is well and truly all over the place. But still, it would be fun if they addressed that in some way. Like, these are some survivors from the first serial that we saw them in or something. One always survives. Anyway, I'll see you next time.